Welcome to what promises to be a really fantastic half an hour on for every aspiring CEO and every leader watching today, quite frankly, right? Um, you're joining us for a very special conversation that's part of our series around the life cycle and the evolution of leadership. And core of that is the idea that leadership isn't static, right? It evolves, it adapts, it transforms throughout one's career, and the challenges that we're facing today are fundamentally different than the challenges that we faced a decade ago, will be fundamentally different than the challenges that we will be facing a decade from now. When we think about the macroeconomic environment, technology, the way we evolve, right? What time does to us. And a key component is that is around how do we continue to adopt, evolve over time, when at the same time we often think about leadership as this static thing in the midst of it. And I could not think of anyone better than you, Nitin, joining us for this conversation. So thank you for making the time.
Delighted to be here. And, it's something that I've been very fortunate to give some thoughts to over the years. I've been studying CEOs now for about 30 years of my life. So it's a group of people that have fascinated me. Maybe they fascinated me because I grew up in a household. My father was fortunate to become CEO of an Indian company. So only when you are older in life, you sometimes realize that your curiosities and your fascinations develop from your personal experience as well. So little did I know that I was not just observing him, but developing a curiosity that would then become my lifelong work.
That's awesome. I didn't know that about you. That's I invited you, quote unquote, to this conversation because you're one of the fundamental, thought leaders in this space. As a student of leadership, a teacher, having shepherded so many, hundreds of CEOs through it, as the former dean of Harvard Business School, right? One of the preeminent scholars in this field. But I didn't realize that you have a first-hand account to what the story unfolds, and you've had a look behind the scene, what the role does to the person carrying the role as well, I imagine, right?
Yeah, it's amazing to live with someone who loved his job and really saw it as a sense of responsibility, which is how I experienced my father. He
Mm.
was running an electrical equipment company at a time when India was just being electrified. So
Yeah.
in his time, we went from a country that had about only 30% of the people in India when my father first took on this job had access to electricity. And by the time he left, about 60% did. And happily, only 2 years ago, finally, 100% of Indians have access to some form of electricity. It just tells you that, the impact that business can have or that CEOs can have, not just on their companies, but on society more broadly is quite profound. And that's what inspired me. So what inspired me and, uh, I felt that this was a job through which uniquely you can make a difference in the world.
Yeah, it's such a good point, right? And yet when we think about these leaders, right, few of us have had the benefit to see them up close in the way you did in your upbringing. I mean, I'm sure you formed your assumptions, right? But when we look at it these days, oftentimes these are these mythical figures that are sometimes, the statue on the hill, if you
Yeah.
may, so that we look up and that we form our preconceptions around them. Some of it right, some of it maybe less well informed, and that was a big part of my passion into pursuing this a little bit more. So questioning the conventional wisdom of what makes a great leader, and what may hold true and what may need to be adjusted, and um,
So
on
just
that.
like you, Claudius, I too ended up, there have been many views of leaders, right? When you think of leaders and the very idea of a leader focuses you on the person. You say that the person is important. So you start to wonder, is there something about, are there traits that leaders have that
Mm,
are really important? So people will sometimes talk about traits like courage, or people will talk about traits like integrity, or people will talk about traits like vision. So there's a lot of work that you think that there's something very special about these people as individuals. And there's a lot of literature that focus on that. And sometimes I say that, if you added up all of the traits literature, then leadership is like an alloy of A to Z, like A for ambition, Z for zeal, and every word in between. You could find an adjective that goes from B through Z as well. And and there's some truth to that. There is something about leaders and there are qualities that they have, but I don't think that there is any one unique quality that distinguishes leaders. So I did a study of the 1,000 great business leaders of the 20th century. Now, one can quibble with how one selects who's great, but at least 900 of them would have been considered great by some measure, and someone would quibble about 100. And from doing this kind of research on leadership, it's always tricky. How do you choose a sample of people
Right.
who you think are very good? But setting that aside, and I was very hopeful that as I studied these 1,000 people, there would be a through line, and maybe two of these attributes would come through, or something else would just emerge as being known. Now that I've studied 1,000 of these people that the world has deemed to
Right.
be great, something would emerge. And I was very disappointed at the end of that, because despite all my analysis, I honestly couldn't find any one thing that was common across these people. Because the world keeps changing, right? So if you think about what leadership looked like at the turn of the 20th century, when the railroads were being built in America and when America was actually becoming one integrated economy,
Yeah.
that's quite different than what leadership looked like during the Great Depression, when
Cool.
America was completely in shambles, or what it looked like during the war, when all of American industry had to be turned to
Yeah.
serving the war effort, or what it looked like during the 60s, or after the internet began to appear on the horizon. So the wonderful thing about business is that it's a permanently dynamic thing. And so the only thing I found from my study of these great leaders is that they seemed to be simultaneously very adept at reading the context of their time and seeing the opportunity that that context would create, from the opportunity to build new businesses, in some other cases, the opportunities to take businesses that were ready to scale,
Yeah.
and in other cases to actually recognize that, like the automotive industry at some point in the 1980s, that it was in decline, or the steel industry, and you needed to drive the consolidation of that decline and find value in that too. And I named that contextual intelligence as one theme, but it's really the opportunity to constantly read the environment and say, what business opportunity does that create? And then the second sense in which I think these leaders were important is that they recognize that they can't do anything alone.
Yeah.
So they have to build the context within their own companies to allow the company to execute and to allow other people. So that's
Yeah.
about building teams, creating the right culture, crafting the right strategy. But these are system level things, not individual heroic things.
Yeah.
So I at least ended up, as a result of this study, saying that leaders have to both read the context and then create the context within their companies that allows everybody to respond to the contextual forces in the world that create economic opportunities of different kinds.
It's so powerful, and it reminds me of my own very sort of arguably naive dabbling in the first days around this concept of leadership effectiveness, because as we were embarking on these over 100 interviews with CEOs, there was always this question like, okay, what's the trait, what's the character, what do you know what's that unique essential thing about you or that you see in others, and just like you, we ended up with basically an alphabet soup of different characters, right? And I'm still curious what your why is, or some of those letters that are a little bit harder to fill. But the reality is it's it's the one question that immediately comes to mind for people. Like, what is it about that individual that it is, that they may have more or less of than others? When in fact it is so many different things that can come to light in the most effective ways when the context is right, right? In the right context, right? It's a strength applied. A strength can also become over applied and become a weakness, right? But where you focus on the context to understand, well, how does a leader react to the context, read the context, and shape it accordingly to prepare themselves and their organizations for the world. My mind began wandering around, well, what does that mean for us, right? Sort of, as I was growing up in my teens and 20s, I was experiencing the world in a different way, and I was prepared, and I was looking around. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of my friends got married within a couple of years from each other. That 10 years before, you wouldn't necessarily have predicted that. And there's something around time that puts us into a certain mode of thinking. And I wanted to understand with the study of the life cycle, what is it? How do we evolve over time as we go from rookie to mid tenure and to veteran? And how does that give us the power to read the context in the right ways or the wrong ways, right? We did this study around potential versus experience. How do first-time CEOs, perform over experienced CEOs? When you ask 100 directors, they'll all tell you, "Oh, I favor the experienced CEO. It's my safety blanket. They know it. They've done it. They've seen the context." But what a lot of people don't appreciate enough is that, a context read accurately once creates a mental image that may push you down the road the second time they encounter a different context. It may look similar on the surface, but it might be a completely different one underneath. And so we're studying how do leaders evolve and how do they stay on their front foot over time. And I'm curious, sort of in our conversations, we talked about this a little bit. Sort of, is time yet another dimension of context, or how do we reintegrate these ideas of leadership over time in its evolution, and context and the evolution of context?
So, I absolutely believe that time is a vital dimension of
Mm,
context because that's what changes, right? I mean, in some ways, the only thing that is constantly changing is time, right? We know for sure that the world of 10 years ago is not the world that we live in today. And we can say with certainty that the world 10 years from now is unlikely to be exactly the same as the world today.
right.
And then every now and then, of course, there are moments in which the rate of change accelerates suddenly. So in my study of leadership over 100 years, I discovered what I uh, describe as a model of punctuated equilibrium, which is, there are
Mm,
periods of time that are relatively defined by a set of variables. So if you just think about the last 20 years, we had a period of globalization. We had a period in which governments throughout the world were embracing business, were embracing free trade. The world as one large global economic system was important. We had the tailwinds of the internet and technology driving the world as a major force. And so into that world, there was a certain kind of leadership that made sense, right? And so if you were a CEO who came of age, or if you were a leader who was growing up of age at that time, uh, there was a certain set of things that you would do. We're now facing a moment in which uh, the configuration suddenly seems to be changing in a very profound way. We are moving towards nationalism being more important than globalization. Who knows what artificial intelligence will do? Just this last week,
yeah.
the markets make us wonder whether, the companies that were the darlings of the last 20 years, SaaS companies, other kinds of companies, will now be disrupted by AI in some important way. Uh, and these moments create an even greater acuity in terms of people having to be very mindful of time, right? So if you're a person who becomes a CEO today, the history that made you successful over the last 20 years of your career, which is the way you ended up getting into the CEO's job,
Yeah.
is something that you have to be mindful is unlikely to serve you well for the next decade of your career. And so how do you think about what this time will bring? And so I think time ends up being a deeply important variable. And this is something that you have written about, which I admire about your work. And we discovered by accident that you and I had done this together. So maybe you should talk about this too. But we have a workshop at Harvard Business School that I've been involved in for the last 30 years, which is a workshop for brand new CEOs. These are CEOs who are actually always first-time CEOs. Typically, they have to be appointed to CEOs of companies that have $5 billion plus of revenue. So think Global 1000 types of companies.
Yeah.
And we invite them to come for in their first year, so they have to be brand new. And the first exercise we ask them to do, which surprises them, is to write their retirement speech. And we ask them to do that because we say, look, it's much better to know what you should do today if you have some sense of the end in mind. Like this job is a time-bound job. the average tenure of a CEO is somewhere between 7 and 15 years. So just cut the difference and say 10. It tends to be 10 if you're successful in your first 3 years. There's a lot of CEOs who get
Right.
fired in their first 3 years if they're not successful. But if you survive the first 3 years, then there's a very high likelihood that you'll stay on for 8 to 10 years. So we say to our CEOs, imagine what the world looks like 10 years from now. And it's a difficult exercise for them because they're so obsessed with what am I supposed to do today with this company that I've just inherited, that they don't remember that today will pass and they will be judged in the end by where they left their company 8 years, 10 years from now. So I think this idea of leading with some sense of the end in mind, even if you can't predict it perfectly, right? So some people will say, but I don't have headlights that allow me to see 10 years from now.
Right.
And that's true, right? Like none of us can fully forecast what the world will
Yeah.
look like 10 years from now. But it is useful to always ask yourself the question as a leader, by the end of my time in this job, what would I have accomplished? And what do I need to have accomplished? By the way, I think that that's not just true for CEOs. It's the advice that I give everybody. So if you have a 3-year assignment, when I ask my students who just graduate, I say, going to have 3 years. At the end of 3 years, what would you have accomplished? And how do you sort of act with the end in mind? But Claudius, you've thought a lot more about this than even I have. So maybe you should say a word or two about what you've learned about how leaders lead with the end in mind first.
Well, I found similar to you when I coach and advise CEOs, especially the new CEOs, those about to step into the role. I do a very similar exercise as you. So like, yeah, write your postmortem, write your, what's going to be written on your gravestone. And and it's a powerful exercise because oftentimes I find, the first draft is it's a little, oftentimes a little shallow, right? Like sort of, and you start digging deeper, and it's a really difficult exercise. What I found is like when you really engage in it, it has so many benefits to it, right? First of all, I mean, we all know that the tyranny of the calendar, right? Like the second someone is announced in a significant leadership role, everyone wants a piece of them, right? And it helps with the long-term orientation to really focus on what matters. What is that through line that I wanna achieve? It doesn't necessarily mean that this is a static line that you have to pursue, right? That you can't veer off anymore. But at least you have direction, conviction, and a clear set of priorities that you want to pursue, right? Um, it helps. I find oftentimes it helps my clients to step out of a particular context that they prepared on, right? But to take into account the long arc, where the world is going, where the industry is going, where they personally want to go, and 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 enter a state of preparedness rather than over preparing for one particular context that then suddenly shifts because, I don't know, tariffs or COVID, or I mean, we've gone through so many of those transformative changes in the last couple of years that just require an incredible amount of adaptation, right?
And
Um,
I think that there was a wonderful saying by someone who it was told to me by the CEO of Amgen, whom I studied many, many years
yeah,
ago, but he was quoting some famous American general who said, why do you engage in plans? After all, uh, plans rarely come out the way we intend for them.
right,
So the CEO said, yet I am, and he was running a biotech company in which it's so hard to plan. And he says, plans are nothing, planning is everything. So even though you might think that what you're doing is, you have to plan not with the idea that the plan is going to come out the way you intend it to be,
yes,
but it creates the mindset and the habit of saying that I will be thinking about the future and then I will adapt as the future adapts. So it's a provisional plan that you constantly update.
right,
And I have found that in studying now through these CEO workshops, I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to meet about 500 plus of these CEOs when they first joined. And I'm now old enough that I've seen the vast majority of them complete their tenures. So we now have a program that we've done for, what happens to CEOs after they retire, because it turns out that that's a huge issue too, which is
a
they don't
huge
have a
issue.
plan for what happens once they retire.
Yeah,
But the CEO journey tends to evolve in broadly three acts. It's like a three-act play. But knowing what what the final act might be actually allows you to do the first act better and to pace yourself to have some sense of, what do I need to get done to prepare the company? And then at some point you have to revisit what you've done in phase A. You have to have the courage to say, did I make mistakes? Do I need to even revisit the choices that I've made? Then there's a second act in which you start trying to institutionalize some of the changes that you made in the early days, because in any job, you get a little bit of a license to make change early on, but then that license has to be renewed because you either renew it because you've been successful and you have to adapt again, or you renew it because you've not been successful and you have to pivot. But one way or the other, Act One is about earning the license to have gained the trust of the organization that you can lead it. Act Two is about regaining and renewing that license. And then Act Three is usually about preparing the organization for succession. And it's interesting that how few leaders realize that at some point their job, in addition to running the company, is to also prepare the company for the leadership that occurs after them, right? And I am blown away by how many CEOs begin to think about that last act too late.
It was powerful. We had a group of 100 CEOs together last year in an event across all tenure stages, and I think it gets to your point there. We did a simple exercise. We just asked everyone, "Hey, 10 people at a time, just sort of stand in the order of your of the date that you assumed the role." And when they did, we asked everyone to introduce themselves and who they are and what's on their mind and how to think about, what their expiry date is. And the first folks who are like a couple of months into the role, they'll tell what's on their mind, and it's typically something to do with like finding, dealing with that fire hose that they're drinking from, etc. But as the room progressed, you would increasingly hear the importance of succession, not only for them, for the company and the future of the company, but also what it means to let go and
Yeah.
what that very personal emotion is when you've been needed, and what it may, what the worry is that, one may not be needed anymore, or one may lose their status, or is the continuity of the company going to be ensured? And it was as fascinating to listen to the progression of those themes as it was to look backwards and look into the faces of those who had gone first and seeing it sort of dawn on them how important this topic is that is clearly not yet, on their radar quite yet. Yes, read about it in textbook, may have thought about it here and there, but it's not top of mind. And that's why I think the power of starting with the end in mind, like seeing these big boulders, thinking in the big acts, as you said, like gain trust, regain trust, think about the generativity of the next phase, how to hand over the baton in a graceful manner is so critical, because from there on you can play back like, okay, what does that mean for my strategy? Which part of the strategy am I actually going to carry forward? And which part of the strategy is just my plan that someone else will have to execute, and I have to give them the degrees of freedom to adopt and adjust accordingly, right? So, um,
Yeah, as you were talking, I was struck by one very simple thing. One thing that we share with our CEOs and is that when they first get the job, one of the most important things they have to do is to select their senior leadership team, because that's the
yeah,
single most important. I think, Jim Collins,
right,
I really love his work, which is, first who, then what, because whatever you do will end up in any casing being redefined by who you choose, right? If you have a B grade leader acting on what is your top priority, I promise you it's no longer going to be your top priority. It's going to end up
mm,
being your B grade priority. So I always say,
right,
take your priorities, and if you then assign them to leadership and you have a sense of how good the leaders are, your priority rank will actually change based upon whom you assign to
that's
each
right.
of the jobs. But CEOs, there's one statistic that at least maybe you have found this in your study too. While there's a range of when someone becomes a CEOs usually the median age for our population is 50, and the variance around that is quite tight. It doesn't end up being that big, at least for
Yeah,
large Fortune Global 1000 type companies. So by definition, I used to say to CEOs, remember this, that if your next CEO also has to be chosen as someone in their 50s, the chances are that almost nobody on the initial leadership team that you select will likely be a candidate to be your replacement.
Right.
So at some point, you have to start putting on your team the people, and this is in Act Two. You have to do it as early as Act Two. Sometimes, if you're wise, you can do it as early as Act One, but you do have to refresh your leadership team to have people on it who will be ready to succeed you. And many people don't realize that because they fall in love with their initial leadership team, and they don't realize that that initial leadership team has a due date, just like they have a due date. And the due date of that team might even be shorter than theirs because it is their responsibility to create the leadership for the next generation. So it's just one other example, I think, Claudius, of the power of what you have been trying to say, which is if you lead with the end in mind, many things become clearer to you in terms of what you need to do.
Yeah.
So, and I, again, there may be people who are listening in who are not CEOs. I have said this to divisional managers, I've said this to functional managers, I've said this to almost any manager, which is think at the end of, imagine how long you think you're going to have this job. And most people think they're going to have a job for 3 to 5 years, unless they have the CEO's job. And it's true, right? Like most other jobs have a time constant that feels more like 3 to 5 years than like 10 years, which is the, the time constant that I think a CEO has to think about. But even in 3 to 5 years, it's always useful to ask the question, what do I hope to have by the end of my time? And I think there's something about most people say, what do I need to do today? We're obsessed by today because today feels so immediate, feels so present, feels so demanding of our urgent attention and time that in doing so, we can sometimes squeeze out or not be mindful of the things that we have to do, which in the end will assess whether we are successful in these jobs or not.
It's such great points, right? This idea of when you think about the CEO role is probably the first role for any executive that is open bound in terms of the time horizon, right? Like, the better you are, the more often you get the promotion, the more often you get, even if it's not a formal promotion, you get some responsibilities added to your plate. There's some kind of change. There's an external component that requires you to change and adapt. And I found that so fascinating as we were studying the evolution of leadership over time, right? And so the beginning, the beginning of stepping into a role is a reinvention in itself, right? Like it's a very different role as a much bigger external component. It's a lot of responsibilities that anyone may not have carried in the past. There's a there's a requirement for change, and there's a typically an open-mindedness about, oh, I need to do more of X and I need to do less of Y, and I need to think about how can I fully, fill this responsibility and carry it forward. What's much harder is this idea of reinventing in place, right? Because at any moment, every strategy will run its course, every team will run its course, right? And I remember a few folks that we were talking about, like CEOs have, they run the risk of sticking to the 250 hitters for too long because they're good people, they're loyal people, right? We formed a relationship. It's difficult. What if I bring someone, what if I bring someone else in? It's going to disturb the equilibrium. We have this important earnings call coming up. Whatever it is, there's plenty of reasons not to change, right? But at the end of the day, when you think about, starting with the end in mind, it's really about change is the constant. Status quo is not the constant, right? And people don't like change, and many people don't like change, but typically what they like even less is this idea of irrelevance, right? And and we've seen this time and time again. We see this in the data when we studied the life cycle. There is this real risk in the mid tenure years when you stick to the tried and true, whether that's your strategy, the way you lead, the way you set up your team, you're really running a big risk of running into complacency trap. And that's not how you want to end your career. That's not where you want to leave your company. And sort of the idea of change and reinvention is a critical piece in all of this, whether we like it or not, right? But what's your thought on this?
I think we're 1 minute from the end, so
Yeah.
I'll probably leave our listeners and again thank them for joining and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. With the insight that I was left with after my study of these 1,000 great business leaders and has continued to stay with me for a long period of time, which is, Darwin had it right. Uh, when Darwin was asked, so tell me, he said, it's not the strongest or the tallest or the fastest that survives. It's the one that is the most adaptive. And I think that what has made us as human beings probably uniquely capable of meeting the evolution in the world is being adaptive as a species. And I think what makes leaders in the end, I think the best is for them to recognize that their success will depend upon continuing to adapt, as you said, and
Yeah.
this adaptation occurs at multiple levels. You have to adapt to the context that the world gives you. You have to adapt and create the context of your company. But then, as you have rightly pointed out, and this is your work, you also have to adapt to the temporal stage in which you are in your own organization. And if you have a meter in your mind, if you have a time clock in your mind, and you have a sense of what the end is, but then you're navigating the time clock to that with that end in mind, I think you'll be more successful. So maybe that's a good point at which we can end our conversation and let everybody else continue with their day.
What a way to drive it home. Success belongs to the most adaptive. Nitin, thank you for spending the time with all of us today. It was incredible. I'd love to continue, but you're right. Like we all have things to get back to, and yeah, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom.
And thank you to you, and thank you to all of everybody who dialed in to join. So I appreciate your attention and your willingness to listen to us. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you.